Okay, so let's talk about a couple of last design features, and this is stuff I'm really interested in getting Nick's take on a little bit. So you see, and it's probably easier to see on that right diagram, where on the back of that hub, cigar line seems to work pretty well, they've flared it, if you will, a little bit. And they do that, and by the way, it's called a diffuser ring, and some props you'll actually see it's a flat bulge, if you will, around the top of that prop. The reason they do that is it helps stop exhaust from circulating around the prop and coming back up and getting on the blades and causing unwanted ventilation / cavitation on top of those blades. But interestingly, it can also increase stern lift, so it can increase hole shot, right? It almost acts a little bit like a trim tab, if you will, is what I read somewhere. That little bit of flare will give you more lift. But interestingly, when you look, it also increases the prop wake very slightly. But if you think about this, if you've ever taken your hose in the backyard and you've got one of those adjustable nozzles, the tighter you make that stream, the harder that stream gets. Kind of the same concept with a prop, right? If you've got a very big prop stream, if it's pushing water out in a circle that big or one out in a circle that big, that's going to give you more thrust. So in a lot of the Mercury racing props, it appears to me they've gotten rid of the diffuser ring, which I suspect makes those props a little bit faster. We're going to ask Nick about that. You can see here I said it tends to widen the prop wake, which adds a small amount of back pressure, blah, 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 a bunch of technical stuff. But it will, that diffuser ring will lower your RPMs at wide open throttle and therefore slow that boat down very slightly. So I thought that was really interesting and something I want to get more in with Nick about, because the Fury props that I run all have that diffuser ring. So if I don't have a problem with hole shot, can I move away from that and possibly pick up more speed with a similar pitch prop? Again, stuff I've learned now that I have questions about. Okay, one more rabbit hole, sorry. So tube length. So again, this is the propellers here, this is the tube, right, on the prop. And the best example of this that I could find was, so the Bravo prop, the Bravo 1 prop has an FS, which is for 4-stroke. It has an LT, which is a long tube. It has an XS, which I think is for extra short tube, and an OC, which I can't, and by the way, I can't find what any of these stand for except the FS, but I'm kind of assuming that's what they are. And I don't know what the OC is. But again, what I learned in going through this is going to a longer tube will actually increase, I want to make sure I get this right. Well, forgive me, I may get this wrong, but I believe I read that the longer tube will increase stern lift, which if you think about it, if you increase stern lift, drops the bow. Now, good in a hole shot, not so good at speed. So what I read was going to those shorter tubes for a boat that needs more nose lift, bow lift, probably is going to get you better performance. So this was a kind of a thing. It's like, okay, do I want a diffuser ring? Do I want a standard tube length? Do I want a short tube length? Do I want a long tube length? All of it's going to be driven by what kind of boat you're running, what kind of load you're running, and what kind of performance you're looking to get out of it. By the way, in rough water, I would assume that a longer tube would probably give you more nose control. I don't know that for a fact, but we're going to talk to Nick about that. Maybe kind of the last thing I want to talk about here. So that's a Bob's jack plate. And we all use jack plate and setback kind of as the same thing, but they're not really the same thing. A jack plate is designed to raise and lower a motor, right? A setback is designed to push that motor further back away from that boat. And that's designed to do two things. The first thing, and I'm not going to say one's more important than the other, but the first thing is to get that prop as far away from the boat wake as you will, to give it as clean a possible water as you can possibly give it, so you get the most prop efficiency, right? You don't want splashes, bubbles, anything coming off the hull of the boat that you can avoid going through that prop diameter, that's going to cause slip and that's going to cause loss of efficiency on it. But the other thing it does is it's a fulcrum, right? It's the old seesaw thing. And when you hang, so a Mercury 250 Pro XS dry with no oil or fuel running through it weighs 505 pounds dry. So if you think about that, 505 pounds on this end of the fulcrum, and by the way, Ultrex weighs 80 something pounds, a lot of weight on the front of the boat. I'd love to see them lighten those up, 80, 90 pounds now that I think about it. But the further you move that motor away from the boat, the more and more you're adding to that fulcrum and getting more and more bow lift, which is a good thing, right? Because now, because you've got that fulcrum automatically giving you that bow lift, you can now get back to that neutral trim, and with less effort from the motor to neutral trim, other than where the motor is set up, to get better performance out of a boat. I think if you guys have watched enough of this, you kind of follow that. But in general, you want to get that motor as far away from the boat as you can in setback. Now, needless to say, the further you move that motor away from the boat, the more pressure you're putting on that transom, which is why most manufacturers limit how much setback you can put on there, because it's just going to put more and more and more pressure on a little piece of fiberglass with that motor's hanging off of. So most manufacturers limit it to 8 or 10 inches. Okay, so here's what we've talked about, and this was from our first video, and we've covered all of these: push-pull theory, angle of attack, blade count, rake, cupping, implications of blade diameter, all the prop styles, skew, ventilation, barrel length, barrel flare, lower unit design, and pitch. So you guys have given me some really great questions, and so we're going to be talking to Nick, and here's the questions we're going to go through with Nick, plus any good ones you guys give me here in the next week. So I want to talk about materials. So most props are made mostly of, according to everything I've read, what's called marine grade stainless steel. But then they also have nickel in them, chromium in them, and then there's some other alloys, including 2 of which that I know of that Mercury has developed in-house. And what happens to the prop, durability, ability to thin the prop down, all of those things when you start mixing and adding those elements. Now, I know from submitting some of these questions to Nick, some of this is proprietary and they're not going to talk to us about it. That's okay. I still want to ask the question and get whatever I can get out of him. And then next, for example, there's a prop that Mercury makes specifically for smaller motors, I think 115 and less, called a Spitfire, that they list as an alloy prop. I'd really like to understand, when they call it an alloy prop, is it still mostly a stainless steel prop or is it completely different? And then I had a great question from a guy. Look, aluminum props are a lot cheaper than stainless steel props. So especially on lower horsepower motors, is there ever an instance where, in our pontoon boat, Dickie and I, on our brush boat, is there ever an instance where you'll get just as good or better performance out of a prop that is not a stainless steel prop, whether it be aluminum, or as the British guys say, I love that, aluminium, or something else, some kind of an alloy prop? So I want to talk about that. And then a lot of you guys have reached out to talk about some of these alloys. I believe using some of those alloys allows them to make those props thinner, and I believe it probably makes them a little bit more brittle. So is that why some guys experience props cracking in the ears and or slinging the blades off of props? So I'm just going to throw that at him and see what he'll say about that. I had watched a video, and I talked about it early on, that says as you add blades above 3 blades, you generally lose efficiency and miles per gallon. I want to know if that's the case. And then I also want to know, when I hear efficiency about a prop, is that synonymous with slip, right? So are those 2 terms synonymous in the prop world? And then another one I thought somebody asked me that was a great question is prop diameter and pitch. When you go from a 14-inch diameter Fury to a Tempest Plus, which is 14.6, so most of us would call that a bigger wheel, if you would, what impact does that have on pitch? I'm assuming you go down in pitch, but I don't know, so I want to ask that. We talked just a second ago about tube length. So do you only run those long tubes on boats that need a lot of stern lift, like a walleye boat or a runabout, or even a really, really heavy bass boat? Guys who run super heavy bass boats, you know, the Ranger Z521c, I think they still make that boat. It's a massive boat. So is that something you would run the long tube on? And then sort of again, I would really like for him to take us through those Bravo props. I think that's the best example, and explain the good and bad of tube length and where you might use those different blades or different, tube lengths, different props in there. I already kind of talked about this, and by the way, you can see I kind of broke these down into materials, and this part's prop design. So when they use that X7, and I put, the other one, I can't remember what it's called, but there's another alloy they put in here. When they use those, and I said X7 twice, but that's not right. Does that allow them to make them thinner? And then also, why is the Fury 4 diameter half an inch bigger than the Fury 3? Just something I noticed and I'm curious about. And then power and lower units. Is there something, I know that, so when I play with my jack plate, when I get too high, I'll feel the nose drop. I don't see a huge drop in RPMs, but I'll feel the nose drop, and actually you'll feel it slow down. But for a guy who doesn't have a hydraulic jack plate, is there something that he would suggest that he would tell him he's either not getting enough stern lift or he's getting too much stern lift? And kind of again, is stern lift synonymous with whole shot or also with running? So I think it's both, because I know when I ran a Fury 4, I felt like the back of the boat set up better. It just ran more on top of the water. So I want to talk to him about that. I'm real curious to understand the power curve difference between the old 2-strokes and the 4-stroke Mercuries, and how might that impact prop selection. And then also when you go to a 4-stroke, which has both, I think, more torque and certainly is allowed to rev higher because you can rev up over 6,200 RPMs, why in general are they recommending most boat makers to drop to smaller diameter props, being the Fury in most cases? Because that seems counterintuitive to me. If I've got all that torque, why don't I want to put it to work with a bigger wheel? And then, do they ever see a situation where a non-surfacing lower unit, again a torque master in my case, would go faster with the 4 or 5 blade than a 3 blade? I understand why they're faster on a Sportmaster where you're getting a lot of that prop out of the water. Would there ever be a case for a torque master? And then back to something we talked about a minute ago. What potentially can happen if you're pushing too much water with a torque master style lower unit? I think I know that it could just spin out, but I want to get his take on that as well. And by the way, don't forget, he's not just a bass boat guy, right? I mean, you see the background picture. Mercury Racing is in offshore, it's in drag boats, they're into everything. So they get a lot of this way more than we as bass fishermen do. And then kind of last, understanding boat performance and kind of the characteristics. How do you know if your boat needs bow or stern lift, right? I mean, is there something that says, well, this characteristic would tell you you need more bow or stern lift? Are there props that, and this was a great question by one of my guys, that typically run better deep, so where the boat really doesn't get much lift? Think, again, heavy bass boats, walleye rigs, pontoon boats. Is there a style of prop that typically would run better there? And maybe, again, maybe that's where you want that stern lift to go to a 4-blade with a long tube. I don't know. I want to ask that. And then this one's from, you guys know Ken A. on the Texas Fishing Forum, who calls himself the Korean Cowboy, by the way. He had an Allison that would run, would turn a 24 pitch, it was a racing Mercury, would turn at 97 RPMs, and he could run 105 in it. And he would drop, and he changed it to a 32 pitch, but he can only turn 8,200 RPMs, but he ran 115. He picked up 10 miles an hour. So in the go fast world, or for any of us, is there a way to find that sweet spot of RPMs and speed other than trial and error? I think the answer to that is no. And I think part of the answer to that is going through this process and kind of learning about what probably is your best prop, so you don't test 10 props, you test 2 or 3. But I want to talk to him about that. And then kind of last, just from a Mercury racing standpoint, can he talk to us as bass fishermen about 4 or 5 props offered by Mercury and or Mercury Racing that would fit on bass or walleye style boats that are non-surfacing lower units and one.
We might consider those various props for different applications. Just some general guidance to us.
And then last question. So blueprinting props. I'm curious to know, I know he talks to people constantly about tweaking props. And by the way, blueprinting a prop basically means, generally speaking, one of 2 things. Making sure that all the ears are the same pitch, so it's balanced, right? And then a lot of times taking a little bit of metal off those props where the blades are a little bit thinner, because I mean, if you think about it, which, you know, a fillet knife is a whole lot thinner than a butcher knife. A fillet knife will go through something a lot easier than a butcher knife will. Same thing with a prop, right? If it takes less horsepower to turn that prop, you can change the prop characteristics and turn a bigger prop or turn a prop with more pitch. So by thinning those blades out, you get a more efficient prop most of the time. So I'm curious, when guys are doing that, when they're spending the money to have it lab finished or blueprinted, are they trying to gain a half a mile an hour, a mile an hour, or are they thinking they're going to gain, or I don't care what they think, are they gaining a half a mile an hour or a mile an hour? Or are they gaining 3, 4, 5 miles an hour? I'm just curious. I've never had a prop work that way. I've had props fixed, which I know when they fix them, most of the time they get them back balanced. But usually when you're fixing a prop, you're taking metal off a prop to make it a smaller prop a little bit. So that's just a question I have for him. So if you guys have any additional questions you'd like me to ask Nick, get them to me in the next week. He and I are going to set up a Zoom call so we can do this and record it and get it out for you guys. So submit them to my email address, kensmithfishing@outlook.com, my Instagram, or come see me on Facebook. And let me know what your questions are, and I'll pose them to him. So hope you guys have enjoyed the first 3 of these. I think we're really going to enjoy sitting down and talking to Nick, and I'll have that up for y'all probably here in about 2.5 weeks. Thanks, guys.